In 2019, Radio Silence delivered probably my favorite horror movie of that year, and for me, Ready or Not is their magnum opus despite their roster being really solid in general. I bet they're pretty glad they dodged a bullet with the new Scream movie, mainly for all the hate that it's getting and especially for all the controversy brought with that movie. But I really don't think there's a bad movie in their filmography. It actually was quite saddening when I saw that Abigail underperformed because even though I'm not a big vampire fan, I really enjoyed that movie. It just feels like they really have found their own identity, blending and most importantly, balancing horror and comedy. Something that I personally struggle with since I'm not the biggest fan of that type of movie because they often end up feeling not balanced at all and leaning way too much into the slapstick comedy turf, often leaving the movie lopsided in my opinion. That subgenre works for some, just not for me. Of course there's exceptions. The entirety of the Evil Dead franchise, Happy Death Day, Freaky are just some examples that I adore. Samara Weaving gave a hell of a performance in creating this horror icon and modern scream queen Grace. Between her tenacious, indomitable will to survive and frankly the stupidity of the family members, she was literally able to survive a clan of monsters. As clever and as strong as Grace is, I think it's often overlooked how moronic the family is, often they themselves being the reason for their own demise. Accidentally shooting each other and poor decision making really gave Grace that edge to ultimately survive because for as awesome as she is, she really isn't a natural born badass Terminator. But that's what I love about her character so much. Sure, watching an Aaron from Your Next is loads of fun, but it's just so much more believable when watching a character like Grace realistically fight for her life and scrape her way to freedom. That's on top of the clever satire about class, and not to mention Grace is literally a bride in a white dress, which is clearly emblematically making her this like ultimate final girl. And in a horror movie, that's quite literally a horror villain's worst nightmare. It's figuratively the epitome of what survives a horror movie, the final boss if you will. It's truly genius work from Radio Silence. That brings us to their newest film, or rather the sequel, Ready or Not 2, Here I Come. 7 years later, we got a sequel to a movie that honestly didn't necessarily need a sequel because the ending was honestly that perfect. It's funny, witty, and ambiguous enough to leave it there, or I guess in this case, continue the story. And the sequel literally continues the story right away because it chronologically happens right after the first movie. Procrastination seems to be one of this movie's biggest enemies because this movie was pre-COVID, which is kind of upsetting. It really shouldn't have taken that long to release, even accounting for the strikes. I will say too, independent of the movie itself, that 7-year gap really makes it hard to believe that this happens right away after the first movie, at least for me, especially since, to be candid, nothing in this movie required such a long wait period because unfortunately it felt like a lot more of the same. Me personally, I kinda imagined that if there was to be a sequel to the original, they could have subverted people's expectations by making Samara's character have to defend herself against the system, since clearly it's a monumental task to prove what actually happened. I don't know, make it a court case or something and you can still have your clever moments about classism and commentary on how there always has to be a kingpin. And how they're good enough writers to have the final girl go up against the system and see how she can survive something on that scale. And then still make the third act go absolutely ballistic and create mayhem to keep in their signature style. Anyway, this time Radio Silence decided to go with a bigger, more well-known cast. Frodo Baggins, Sarah Michelle Gellar, and even David Cronenberg all star as these crazy rival families to the Domos that want the seat of power. And on Grace's side, Catherine Newton stars as her sister Faith. That is questionable because literally in the original, Grace says how she's detached from her family and why no one from her side was showing up to the wedding. That's one thing I won't scrutinize the movie for because I love Catherine Newton. I think all her performances are awesome except for Paranormal 4. Freaky was awesome. Lisa Frankenstein with Cole Sprouse was really underappreciated, and I am a very big defender of Abigail, so her track record is awesome. I just think she brings such a fun energy to all her performances, and an actor like her is perfect to bounce off of Samara Weaving. The things that worked for this movie was definitely the dynamic between Grace and Faith. I think despite the estranged family trope that honestly never really justifies itself, the girls together had plenty of chemistry and a good amount of charming sequences together. Catherine Newton independently was great. Like I said before, she brings this fun color to the table, which is neat. Samara Weaving is unsurprisingly still the heart of this project. It's been 7 years, but her performance is just as strong. She didn't lose her edge in that time gap. In fact, she's so good that it ends up harming the film because she's quite literally carrying the film on her shoulders, and it's to the point that the movie's quality just can't keep up with the quality of her performance. Her scream is still the most cathartic and iconic elements of these movies. I also thought it was so cute how her putting on her bloodied wedding dress was like the equivalent of Michael putting on his mask or Cap getting his shield. They treat it like it's her battle gear, and I love it. I also thought it was hilarious how I was just saying that in the original movie, having a girl in an all-white dress made her virtually untouchable in horror, and a girl does that same thing in this movie and gets absolutely decimated. Apart from that, there's a clever contrast where the duology starts with Grace in a crisp all-white dress and it ends with her in a rather beautiful black dress. It's a neat touch. The brutality in this movie is consistent and arguably a little bit more intense. The washing machine was crazy and the beatdown that was given on Faith was insane. I will say at some point she gets a really cool sword, but there's never any payoff for it, and it sucks because I was really looking forward to that. The humor is also still present. I don't think it's as funny as the original, but it's still clever. And the absurdity of the movie is something I wouldn't consider a con because it just feels right in a movie like this. Sure, you can question how Grace should really be wrecked and in a full body cast, but by the end it really just looks like she just accidentally scratched herself with her nail. The removal of a giant rod in her shoulder isn't enough to stop her from walking away peacefully by the end. The families are still idiots, which gives a lot of room for chuckles throughout the movie too. The biggest problem that I think this movie will face, and that the general consensus for this movie will probably be, is that it's just fine. My issue with that description for a movie like this is that you can excuse big blockbuster movies because often the expectation is just so high that you can't possibly match it. There's just so many variables that make those expectations stupidly high for blockbusters that it becomes an arduous task to be able to meet those expectations. Small movies like Ready or Not that are beloved within a much smaller niche can't rely on being fine because you're hurting the overall image of a name that was otherwise considered great, like the original was. These movies aren't breaking box office numbers, and prior to this, if you watched Ready or Not, you probably walked away with a "wait, that was awesome" type of reaction. Yeah, the sequel wasn't needed because ultimately it didn't improve on the concept that made the original so interesting. That original will now forever be looked at as that gem that has the attachment of the fine follow-up. It doesn't diminish the greatness of the original, and obviously it's its own movie, so it's still a gem of course, but it's forever muddied by having a sequel that just wasn't necessary. It kinda bothers me to say that because I did enjoy the movie and I liked it and I thought it was fun, and I love that Catherine Newton is now in this movie, but objectively speaking it just wasn't necessary. In terms of the actual plot, it just feels like it's more of the same, which would be fine if we hadn't already seen so many movies do similar things before and since the original. Yeah, rich people are insane, we get it. While it's nice to see Sarah Michelle Gellar not be a stupid phantom in a stupid movie that shouldn't exist, and it's nice to see Elijah Wood on screen again, I don't think either of them are doing a particularly great job here. Personally, after watching Elijah Wood in Come to Daddy, I just prefer when he's more of an oddball, and hell, this was the perfect premise to have him really go off the deep end, but instead it makes him one of the most normal characters. That's such a strange choice. There's also no crazy plot insanity in this movie. Like, one of the many awesome things about the original was the many absurd and abrupt moments that made the movie feel unpredictable. This movie is shockingly safe to where everything you think is going to happen, it happens. It's still a satire and pokes fun at the idea of one root dies and another one is born. Killing the original crazy family isn't gonna solve the problem because there's always gonna be another crazy rich family. But it's just not as engrossing of a point of commentary as the movie wants it to be. It's just not as sharp of a story as the original is. Yes, it's still very bloody and the gore lives up to the expectations because it's still goriest and the kills are bountiful and brutal, but ultimately the biggest reason to watch this movie is to support Radio Silence, Catherine Newton, and of course Samara Weaving, and I guess that's a fine enough reason. But that's it for me. I'd appreciate a thumbs up, subscribe, and sincerely yours, Anthony.